June 22nd, 1944. Saipan, Mariana Islands. Sergeant Takeshi Watanabe pressed his back against the cave wall, the rifle in his hands slick with sweat and blood. Outside, the thunder of American artillery had fallen silent. The invasion was over. His unit was gone. The bodies of his comrades lay scattered across the volcanic ash outside, their final banzai charge having accomplished nothing but their own annihilation. For 3 days he had hidden here in the darkness, listening to his own breathing, waiting for the courage to complete what his training demanded. 1 bullet. That was all honor required. 1 bullet to avoid the shame of capture, to preserve his family's dignity, to fulfill the oath he had sworn to his emperor. Before you witness what happened when he emerged from that cave, like and subscribe to help keep this history alive. Comment where you're watching from. Share this video with others who should learn history's most powerful lessons. Now watch as everything Sergeant Watanabe believed about surrender, about enemies, about his own worth, unraveled in the most unexpected way possible. An American voice called into the darkness, not harsh but almost gentle. Come out. Water here. Food here. The words were clumsy, clearly read from a phrase card, the Japanese pronunciation awkward in the Marine's mouth. Watanabe's finger trembled on the trigger. He had been taught this was the voice of demons, that Americans tortured prisoners for sport, that capture meant degradation worse than death. The propaganda posters had shown it clearly, American soldiers with devil horns, their hands dripping with blood. Yet something in his body, something primal and desperate, overrode his training. The hollow ache of 3 days without water, the trembling weakness of starvation, the infection spreading hot beneath the shrapnel wound in his thigh. His body wanted to live even as his mind insisted he should die. When he stumbled into the blinding Pacific sunlight, hands raised, legs barely holding him upright, he braced for everything he had been promised. The rifle butt to the face. The mocking laughter of victors, the beginning of his end. Instead, a Marine young, perhaps 20, with sunburned skin peeling across his nose, stepped forward and handed him a canteen. Not threw it at his feet, handed it to him. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Watanabe saw not hatred, but something closer to exhaustion. Perhaps even relief that another enemy had chosen survival over suicide. The water was cool, clean, real. It tasted of metal and chemicals, but it was the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. And in that single moment of mercy, as water ran down his chin and soaked into his filthy uniform, Sergeant Watanabe's entire understanding of war began to collapse. The Japanese military had built its soul on Bushido, the ancient warrior code filtered down from samurai traditions into modern Imperial doctrine. But the Bushido taught to soldiers like Watanabe was not the nuanced philosophy of feudal warriors. It had been simplified, weaponized, transformed into an ideology of absolute obedience and self-sacrifice. Surrender was the ultimate dishonor, worse than death itself, a stain on family and ancestors that could never be washed away. From basic training onward, soldiers were told that capture by the enemy meant torture, humiliation, and suffering so severe that suicide was the compassionate alternative. Officers distributed grenades with specific instructions. Save the last one for yourself. The message was clear and uncompromising. Better to die clutching your rifle than live as a prisoner. Better to charge into machine gun fire than raise your hands. Better to starve than beg for food from the enemy. This wasn't just military discipline. It was identity. It was the core of what made a Japanese soldier different from all others. The willingness to die without hesitation, without complaint, without the weakness of self-preservation. Officers who lost battles committed seppuku rather than face the shame of defeat. Soldiers who could no longer fight were expected to take their own lives rather than burden their units. The sick and wounded were often left behind when units retreated, given just enough ammunition to defend themselves until death came. Mercy in this system was considered weakness. Suffering was proof of devotion, and surrender was the ultimate betrayal of everything the emperor represented. The Americans approached war differently. By 1944, U.S. forces operated under strict Geneva Convention protocols for prisoner treatment. POWs were to receive adequate food, medical care, shelter, and protection from abuse. This wasn't pure altruism. American commanders understood that well-treated prisoners provided better intelligence. That humane treatment could encourage further surrenders, saving American lives by reducing the fanatical resistance that characterized Pacific combat. They understood that how America handled captives would shape post-war relations and international perceptions. But the policy also reflected something deeper, something woven into American military culture from its democratic foundations. A conviction that even in war's brutality, certain human dignities remained inviolable. A captured soldier was still a human being, with rights that could not be erased simply because he wore an enemy uniform. That principle, so fundamental to American thinking, would prove incomprehensible to men raised in the code of Bushido. The numbers tell part of this story. By August 1945, Allied forces had captured approximately 38,000 to 50,000 Japanese military personnel across the Pacific theater. This sounds substantial until compared to other theaters. In Europe, millions of German soldiers surrendered as the war turned against them. But in the Pacific, surrender remained almost unthinkable. Early in the war, the numbers were vanishingly small. On Tarawa in 1943, only 17 Japanese soldiers surrendered out of a garrison of 4,800. The rest fought until killed or killed themselves. At Iwo Jima in 1945, only 216 were captured from a force of 21,000. Most of those captured were unconscious from wounds or physically unable to resist. The Japanese fought with a ferocity born from absolute conviction that capture meant something worse than death. They had seen their own forces treat Allied prisoners with staggering cruelty. Why would the Americans be any different? What they couldn't imagine was that the enemy might play by entirely different rules. When Sergeant Watanabe arrived at the POW collection point on Saipan, he moved through a fog of disbelief. The staging area was organized chaos, wounded men being triaged, interpreters shouting questions, guards directing prisoners into groups. Medics examined his wounds without ceremony. The shrapnel cuts on his leg and arm had festered for days, the flesh around them angry and swollen. An American corpsman, a kid who looked younger than Watanabe felt, cleaned them with careful hands. The antiseptic burned like fire, but the touch was gentle, professional. He applied sulfa powder, wrapped the wounds in clean white bandages, made a note on a clipboard. No beatings, no mockery. Just medical care, methodical and professional, as though Watanabe's pain mattered. Around him, other prisoners sat on the ground in the shade of palm trees, holding canteens, eating from ration tins. One man wept openly, shoulders shaking, overwhelmed not by cruelty, but by its absence. The food was substantial crackers, canned meat, chocolate. More calories in a single K ration than many Japanese soldiers had seen in a week. By 1944, Japanese supply lines across the Pacific had collapsed. Soldiers on isolated garrisons were starving, reduced to eating grass, roots, anything remotely digestible. Some units practiced cannibalism in desperation. The Imperial Army had simply abandoned thousands of its own soldiers to die slowly of hunger and disease. Watanabe ate slowly, mechanically, half convinced the food was poisoned, waiting for the trap to spring. His stomach, shrunken from months of inadequate rations, cramped and rebelled. But the trap never came. The food was real. The water kept flowing. And with each hour that passed without violence, the cognitive dissonance grew more unbearable. The contrast was savage and undeniable. While Japanese prisoners in American custody received 3 meals daily, Allied POWs in Japanese camps subsisted on starvation rations, a handful of rice, often contaminated with insects and dirt, sometimes supplemented with nothing more than thin soup made from vegetable scraps. The mortality rate for Allied prisoners under Japanese control reached 27% on average, spiking to 40% or higher in certain camps. Of the 27,000 Americans captured in the Pacific, more than 11,000 died before liberation. They perished from starvation, from tropical diseases left untreated, from execution for minor infractions, from forced labor so brutal that men's bodies simply gave out. They died in the holds of unmarked transport ships, torpedoed by their own side. They died on construction projects building railways and airfields, worked 16-hour days on handfuls of rice until they collapsed. American POWs in German camps, despite the hardships, faced a mortality rate of roughly 1 to 4%. In American custody, Japanese POW mortality was less than 1%. The difference wasn't just numbers on a page. It was philosophy. It was two civilizations operating from fundamentally opposed understandings of what a human life was worth. Within days, Sergeant Watanabe and other prisoners were transported to larger POW facilities, some in Hawaii, others eventually to camps scattered across the continental United States. The journey itself was disorienting. They traveled on transport ships, confined below deck, but not chained or beaten. Guards did not strike them for speaking or moving. They were given water regularly, handed out by young sailors who looked at them with curiosity rather than hatred. When the transport ship hit rough seas and prisoners vomited in the cramped quarters, American personnel cleaned the mess without hostility or punishment. One prisoner later recalled the simple act of being handed a blanket during a cold night at sea as the ship traveled north toward Hawaii. "I thought it must be a mistake," he said years later in an interview. "I waited for someone to take it back. I kept it folded on my lap, afraid to use it. But no one came. Eventually I wrapped it around my shoulders and cried because I could not understand why they would give me warmth." That blanket, like the bandages, like the canteen of water, became a small crack in the wall of ideology these men had lived behind their entire lives. The camps themselves shattered expectations completely. POWs were housed in barracks with actual beds and mattresses, not bamboo platforms or dirt floors. The barracks had roofs that didn't leak, walls that kept out wind, windows that let in light. They received regular meals that arrived like clockwork. Breakfast often included eggs, bread, and coffee. Real coffee, bitter and hot, served in metal cups. Lunch and dinner featured meat, vegetables, potatoes, or rice, portions that seemed almost obscene to men accustomed to rations measured in grams. Some prisoners gained 20, 30, even 40 pounds within their first few months of captivity, their bodies physically transforming from the skeletal frames of imperial soldiers to something closer to normal health. Their cheeks filled out, their ribs stopped showing. The hollow look left their eyes. Medical care was routine and comprehensive. Dentists treated tooth decay that had plagued men for years, drilling and filling cavities with actual anesthetic. Doctors performed surgeries to repair old injuries. Broken bones that had healed incorrectly were re-broken and set properly. One prisoner suffering from chronic malaria contracted in the New Guinea jungles received quinine and actual bed rest in a camp infirmary until the fever cycles broke. In the Japanese military, such illness would have been ignored or treated as weakness. The sick man expected to push through or die quietly. Here it was simply addressed as a medical problem requiring medical solutions. The Americans even provided glasses for prisoners whose vision had deteriorated, a consideration so unexpected that some men wept when they could see clearly again after years of squinting. The Americans allowed prisoners to work voluntary labor details that earned small amounts of scrip for use in camp canteens where they could purchase toiletries, cigarettes, writing paper. Some Japanese POWs helped maintain camp facilities. Others worked in kitchens preparing food, others on agricultural projects growing vegetables. They were paid for this labor, a concept that struck many as bizarre. Payment implied value, respect, agency. These were not terms that fit the Bushido definition of captivity. In the Japanese understanding, prisoners existed only to suffer. The idea that captors would compensate them for work challenged everything they knew. Recreation time was provided. This, too, was incomprehensible. Guards distributed books, some in Japanese that had been confiscated or purchased, others in English for those interested in learning the language. Musical instruments appeared: harmonicas, guitars, even a piano in one camp that someone kept in tune. On quiet evenings, prisoners gathered to play music or sing traditional songs from home that carried across compounds where barbed wire marked boundaries but did not define the atmosphere within. Some prisoners took up painting or calligraphy. Others played baseball with equipment provided by the Americans, forming teams that competed against each other while guards watched from the sidelines with casual interest rather than hostility. The normalcy of it all was deeply abnormal. Letters became another revelation. Prisoners were told they could write home to families in Japan. Many assumed this was propaganda, a trick to extract information or create false hope. The first letters were cautious, brief, stripped of any detail. But the letters were actually processed, censored only for military information, and then sent through neutral countries via the International Red Cross. Months later, replies began arriving. Thin envelopes with Japanese writing passed out during mail call, like Christmas miracles. Families in Japan, starving in cities reduced to ash by American firebombing, learned their sons and husbands were alive, well-fed, and safe in enemy hands. The irony was almost unbearable. Some prisoners wrote cautiously of adequate treatment, careful phrases that wouldn't sound like propaganda. Others more boldly described meals and medical care their families could not imagine. One prisoner wrote to his mother, "I have gained weight. There is rice every day and meat and medicine when I am sick. I do not understand this war anymore." Japanese authorities intercepted many of these letters, intelligence officers troubled by testimonies that contradicted their narrative of American barbarity. How could captivity offer more security than service to the emperor? How could the enemy show more care for Japanese soldiers than their own commanders had? The questions had no comfortable answer. Some officials suggested the letters were forgeries, American psychological warfare designed to encourage surrender. But the handwriting was authentic. The personal details were accurate. The cognitive dissonance spread from prisoners to their families to Japanese society itself, a quiet undermining of the ideology that had sent millions to die. Intelligence officers quickly learned that humane treatment yielded cooperation far more effectively than torture ever could. Japanese POWs, initially silent and sullen, began to speak more freely as weeks passed, and they realized punishment wasn't coming. Some provided tactical information about troop movements, fortifications, and supply routes. Others shared insights into Japanese military culture, the mindset of officers, and the morale of troops on isolated garrisons. This wasn't interrogation through torture or coercion. It was conversation, sometimes over cigarettes and coffee, between men who had stopped seeing each other as monsters. Not all prisoners adjusted easily. Some refused food at first, convinced it was poisoned or designed to shame them into collaboration. Others clung fiercely to the belief that surrender was unforgivable, sinking into deep depression as they grappled with the dishonor they believed they had brought upon their families. A few attempted suicide, unable to reconcile their survival with their training. Camp administrators learned to watch new arrivals carefully, the period when shame could become lethal. But over time, most came to a quiet, uncomfortable realization. The enemy had treated them with a dignity their own officers had never shown. They had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that capture meant degradation and death. Instead, they had been given food, medicine, beds, and the simple acknowledgement that their lives had worth. By 1945, as the war neared its conclusion, the psychological impact of humane treatment began to ripple outward. Rumors spread among Japanese forces that American captivity was not the horror they had been promised, and on some islands more soldiers began to surrender. On Okinawa, Japanese soldiers and civilians emerged from caves rather than commit suicide, encouraged by leaflets and loudspeaker broadcasts describing POW treatment. The willingness to consider capture was revolutionary. When the war ended in August 1945, thousands of Japanese POWs faced repatriation. Many returned to a homeland transformed by firebombing, the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the emperor's public announcement of surrender. Food was scarce, infrastructure shattered, and survival uncertain. For some, the transition was harder than captivity, after months of regular meals and medical care. One former POW wrote that he returned to see his mother thin with hunger, ashamed not of surrender, but of learning his leaders had valued him less than his enemies. American kindness became an unintended weapon, forcing many to confront that enemies could be compassionate. Many carried this quiet transformation for life. The camps had not been paradise, they were still prisons, bounded by wire and guard towers, supervised by armed men. But within those bounds, something radical had happened. Human beings had been treated as human beings, and for men raised to believe their worth existed only in death, that simple truth was more powerful than any weapon, more transformative than any victory. It was proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, kindness could survive, that even between enemies, dignity could be preserved, and that sometimes the most devastating defeat comes not from losing a battle, but from discovering that everything you were taught to believe was a lie.